What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we are going over when to target running backs. We're going to go through each tiers of running backs throughout the rankings, compare them to the players being drafted around them in the field, and let you know which stages of the draft we think the optimal time to draft the running back position will be. Obviously, it's not one size fits all, but by the end of it, you will have a good understanding of our 2020 strategy when targeting running backs. Before we do get into the video though, stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running back had the most targets inside the 5-yard line. The correct answer, Austin Ekeler. As for today's stat of the day, which running back led the league in breakaway percentage? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Also, guys, be sure to check out our website. Consider signing up for our draft package. Not only is it loaded with information guaranteed to help you win your league, but you'll also be able to join our private community and be eligible for exclusive giveaways courtesy of our friends at Pristine Auction. And if you'd like a free $5 credit for Pristine Auction, go to their website. When you sign up for an account, use code FFA. It's literally a free $5, so there really is no downside, so consider signing up with them. With all that stuff out of the way though, let's start the video. So to start, let's talk a bit about the tier 1 running backs. The tier 1 running backs consist of Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, and Alvin Kamara. No surprises there, and if you do have a top 4 pick, you are almost forced to take these players, and that's exactly what we would advise you to do. Simply put, wide receivers don't have the same upside as workhorse running backs, especially the safe ones that are involved in the receiving game. When comparing top 5 running back production to top 5 wide receiver production, the running back position simply scores more, so if you do land one of those top 4 picks, the only real decision you have is to draft one of those 4. Now, where some first round confusion may begin is when deciding if you're going to take a wide receiver after those 4 running backs are off the board. There are 2 very solid tier 1 wide receivers in Michael Thomas and Davante Adams, and while running backs, they do score more points at the high end, these 2 tier 1 wide receivers are extremely safe and still do provide your team a significant amount of upside. Let's take a look at the tier 2 running backs and compare them against players being drafted around them. There are 8 total running backs in the second tier, and while being in the same tier does mean we should expect somewhat similar production when it comes to what we can expect from a season-long perspective, there will come a point where we do have to draft a receiver over a running back, because even at the high end, running backs do score more points. At a certain point, the value of taking a wide receiver over a tier 2 running back is guaranteed to at some point outweigh the fact that the running backs simply score more points. While there is a case for taking potentially somebody like Derrick Henry or Joe Mixon over a player like Davante Adams or even potentially Michael Thomas, if you're in the range where Miles Sanders, Kenyon Drake, Josh Jacobs, and Nick Chubb are available, and you still see Michael Thomas and Davante Adams on the board, it's a no-brainer to take them. While we couldn't fault you for wanting to secure a running back with a hefty workload, it would definitely be a mistake if you were heading into the draft with the mindset that no matter what, you are having to draft a running back in the first round, especially if you have a pick that's in the middle or back end of the first round. Whenever it comes to fantasy drafts, you have to be flexible. We should never be reaching in the early rounds, especially in the first and second round, so you have to be aware of each player's value, see which players fall to you that you have ranked the highest, then pull the trigger on that player regardless of position. Let's take a look at the ADP though. The running backs we have as tier 2 running backs have a range of being drafted between the 6th overall pick with Dalvin Cook all the way back to the 20th overall pick with Miles Sanders. Obviously, massive gap there. Regardless though, you do have to be aware if there is any value you can extract at the wide receiver position. In 12-team league snake drafts, in order to have 2 picks within the top 20, your draft spot would have to be the 5th through the 12th pick. With that being the case though, this is a perfect example of why you shouldn't be afraid to draft a wide receiver with the first pick if the value falls to you. While players like Drake, Aaron Jones, and Miles Sanders may not have the same combination of safety and upside, but even if you started your draft with Davante Adams as your wide receiver 1 and followed that up by pairing that with a player like Kenyon Drake, there's no way when the draft is completed and you're looking back at your team, you're going to feel like you made a mistake in the early rounds. So let's move over to the tier 3 running backs, and once again we do have several names in this tier, a lot of names that provide a significant amount of question marks. Each player listed in the tier 3, you can make a relatively strong case for how they could bust in 2020. One of the downsides downsides when drafting wide receiver and wide receiver back to back is that there is a chance that you do finish the draft with one of these types of running backs as your RB1. If given the choice in a vacuum of if we would prefer to draft 2 wide receivers in the first 2 rounds or 2 running backs, we would 100% of the time suggest taking 2 running backs because clearly the depth and safety at this position falls off a cliff. Let's compare it to the wide receivers being drafted in this range. Austin Ekeler comes in at the highest draft cost of these tier 3 running backs. The lowest ADP tier 3 running back is Jonathan Taylor, being picked up as the 50th overall pick. It's safe to assume that these tier 3 running backs can be drafted between the 3rd and the 4th rounds. When comparing the running backs being drafted in that range to the wide receivers being drafted around them, we're starting to see a shift where the value at wide receiver is starting to outweigh the value at running back. For example, going based off of ADP, you have Austin Ekeler being taken 1 spot ahead of Mike Evans, but when comparing them to the position, Austin Ekeler is the 13th running back off the board. Compare that to Mike Evans, who's a top 8 receiver based on ADP. So due to the first 2 rounds being very RB heavy, there is going to be this tipping point when you're going to see a run on wide receivers. In fact, between the 2nd and 4th round, we're seeing it being so wide receiver heavy when it comes to who's being drafted that even though 12 of the first 20 picks are running backs, by the end of the 4th round, pick 48, we actually see a complete even split in which 21 running backs are expected to come off the board and 21 wide receivers. So what you should expect heading into the draft is that there will be runs on each position. There will be a run early of running backs. Then as we creep into the 3rd round, you're going to start to see a run on wide receivers. It's very important to be aware of this because one thing you don't ever want to do in fantasy football is to be a player who's reactionary by ultimately drafting players at the end of runs. We always want to start runs and not end runs. And in order to ensure that you do this, you have to be aware of when these runs are starting and when these runs are finishing. If 15 running backs are off the board, yet you can still land a top 10 receiver, your first reaction may be to get a running back because that position is starting to run thin, but the correct draft selection choice would actually be to take the wide receiver. This is exactly why it's very important to make sure that you nab a running back in the first 2 rounds, because the last thing that you're going to want to do is to start off your draft with 3 wide receivers and ultimately have your RB1 or RB2 be one of these tier 4 running backs. So let's take a look at the tier 4 running backs. There are 7 players we have listed in this 4th tier, but ideally none of these we would want to have in the RB2 slot. These players definitely make much stronger flex plays as opposed to starters that you have no choice of putting in regardless of matchup, and the range in which these running backs are coming off the board is between the 5th and the 6th round. One thing that we do know is that based on the data, the bust rate in players being drafted from the 5th round on, it spikes dramatically. Having one of these as your RB2 is very risky. Cases where you'll run into this being an issue and having one of these players in your RB2 slot is if you've drafted an early round quarterback or tight end, someone like George Kittle or maybe Patrick Mahomes, and even considering that drafting those players does give you a positional advantage, it's very possible you could leave the draft not really liking your team because you may be lacking depth at a certain position. This is why preferably we always suggest to draft quarterbacks and tight ends later, stack up on running backs as early as you can, but it's understandable that sometimes tight ends and quarterbacks will fall to you even if your intention was to grab one in the later rounds. If you do end up having to have one of these tier 4 running backs as your RB2, you should value safety, so try to aim for a player that does have a guaranteed workload or a high receiving floor. Players like David Montgomery, who's guaranteed to be getting the bulk of the work out of the backfield, or somebody like Kareem Hunt, who you know is going to see 8 or 9 targets in several games throughout the season, even while Nick Chubb is healthy. A player that also provides top 5 upside if anything were to happen to the running back ahead of him. Even though these tier 4 running backs do provide some level of risk when it comes to either being on a poor offense or the competition for touches, it's still very important to load up on running backs before you exit the tier 4, because when it comes to the tier 5 running backs and beyond, the volume and workload is no way guaranteed whatsoever. Let's take a look at those tier 5 running backs. Of these tier 5 running backs, there is only one of them on this list that does have a secure workload, and that's Sony Michel, but he's on what we should expect to be a poor offense. So preferably, each of these running backs, you should expect to play no more of a role than a bench player with some upside. Of the tier 5 running backs listed above, not one of them do we have listed as a target, so it's not as if the running backs being drafted in this range are players that we think are are being undervalued. By this point, you do want to ensure that you have at least 3 running backs that do have somewhat of a role in their offense, because if you don't and you endure either early injuries to the running back position and potentially couple that with an early bye week, that's a quick way to rack up some early losses or force you to make a trade you would not normally take. Currently, the running backs that are being drafted in this tier are coming off the board in and around the 6th through the 9th round, and this is also a stage in the draft where we're starting to see more value at the wide receiver position. And also in this range, you may want to consider taking a quarterback if you hadn't done so far this draft. While none of the running backs we have from this point on are listed as targets and are at best sleepers, there are still 7 wide receivers that we have throughout the remaining portion of the draft that we still classify as targets, players that could have a significant role early on despite having a low ranking. When it comes to production that you can guarantee from the running back position at this stage, it's virtually non-existent, and we're starting to get into handcuff territory. But moving into the final stages of the draft, that being outside of the top 100, when targeting running backs in this range, there are a few things that you want to look for and certain types of players we should be avoiding. Contrary to the earlier rounds in the draft where we do value volume as well as receptions, by the triple digits, we should have already drafted players on our team that do provide that service. At this point, we should be taking shots on players that have no guaranteed floor, and we want to value the potential upside. There are certain handcuffs that we like to target, ones that if the running back ahead of them did go down with an injury, they would have an RB1 ceiling. Some examples of these types of players are Tony Pollard, who would take the place of Zeke if there were an injury, as well as Chase Edmonds, who we've already seen in the past, when given a heavy workload in this Arizona offense, put up top 10 running back numbers. And the types of players we want to be avoiding are players like Tariq Cohen, who yes, he will be putting up fantasy points every week while healthy, but even if David Montgomery were to go down, it's just unrealistic to expect he's going to step in and take the full workload. Another example would be a player like Ronald Jones, who has a history of his coaching staff being unwilling to give him a full workload, as well as being disappointing when we've seen him receive the touches. You do want to round out your roster with taking as many of these players that you can. We obviously have a limited amount of roster spots, which is why we do recommend trying to stick to 1 quarterback and drafting 1 tight end. While we may run into situations where that isn't the case, for the most part we do want to save room for these high upside running back picks at the tail end of the draft. These are the types of players that if they do hit and reach their ceiling, we've consistently seen these types of players be league winning type selections. But guys, I hope that helped you understand the running back position and our strategy when drafting it. If you did enjoy this video, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.